In the autumn of 1887, the wind across Pembina County, North Dakota, was a promise and a threat. It carried the scent of harvested wheat and the distant, sharp chill of the Canadian Shield, a prelude to the iron-fisted winter that would soon grip the plains. Here, on the vast, unforgiving checkerboard of the American frontier, progress was measured in acres broken and structures razed. The settlers, mostly second-generation Americans or immigrants from Germany and Ireland, built as their fathers had, with brute force and a belief that bigger was always better. Their barns were cavernous, their houses tall with high ceilings meant to convey a sense of prosperity, a defiance against the crushing flatness of the landscape. They built with thick, single-plank walls, confident that a larger stove and a bigger woodpile were the only answers to a deeper cold. Among them lived a man who did things differently. His name was Axel Johansen, a quiet Norwegian who had arrived 2 years prior with little more than a set of well-oiled tools and a memory of a different kind of cold. While his neighbors raced to erect their grand timber frames against the sky, Axel worked on a scale they found baffling, almost insulting. He had built a standard, sturdy barn, much like their own. But then he began constructing something else inside it. A small, strange, curved structure, like the overturned hull of a boat, nestled in the center of the barn's vast, empty floor. It was a house within a house, a kernel inside a shell. The community watched his progress with a mixture of pity and scorn. They called it Johansen's Nest. Mr. Silas Croft, a man whose opinion carried the weight of his considerable landholdings, stood at Axel's fence line one afternoon, his arms crossed. "That's a house inside a barn," he declared to his companions, not as a question, but as an indictment. "Wasting all that good space. The man's building a cradle for a giant." The laughter that followed was dry and brittle, carried off by the same wind Axel seemed so intent on hiding from. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. To them, it looked like fear. They saw a man shrinking from the vastness of the prairie, retreating into a shell when he should have been building a fortress. His low, curved roof seemed an admission of defeat, a bow to the elements rather than a proud fist shaken at the sky. They did not know that in less than 4 months, a storm of unimaginable fury, a blizzard that would be spoken of for a century, would descend upon them. It would later be called the Schoolhouse Blizzard, a maelstrom of ice and wind that would kill hundreds across the plains. In the aftermath, when the world was a uniform blinding white, it would become clear that the grand, tall houses with their roaring fires had become ice boxes, their single thick walls little more than frozen drum skins amplifying the wind's howl. And in the heart of the storm, one small, foolish-looking structure would remain an island of profound and life-saving warmth. The laughter would freeze on their lips, replaced by a desperate, shivering question. What did Axel Johansen understand about the unforgiving laws of thermal dynamics, about the physics of stillness and the tyranny of moving air, that everyone else, in their pride and haste, had dismissed as the timid folly of a stranger? What did he know that would mean the difference between life and death? Axel Johansen's knowledge was not born of formal education or scientific treatises. It was a wisdom of the bone, inherited through generations of survival in a place where the cold was ancient and intimate. He came from the coast of Norway, north of Trondheim, a land of deep fjords and relentless, salt-laden winds that could strip the heat from a man's body in minutes. There, the enemy was not just the depth of the cold, but its dampness and its persistence. He had learned from his grandfather, a boat builder and fisherman, that the most effective barrier was not always the thickest, but the smartest. The genesis of his strange Dakota structure lay in a specific memory, his grandfather's shoreside workshop. It was a large, drafty wooden building where boats were mended. The wind howled through its unchinked planks, yet in one corner, his grandfather had built a small, 6-by-8-foot room. It was not attached to the outer walls. Instead, it stood free, with a gap of several feet on all sides. This inner sanctum was where he kept his delicate tools, his glues, and his finishing oils. While the main workshop might be thick with frost, the air inside this small room remained still, dry, and consistently above freezing. heated by nothing more than a single, small lantern. Död Luft, his grandfather called it. Dead air. The wind can fight the walls, he would say, tapping the outer building, but it cannot touch this room. Its anger is spent in the space between. This principle was the cornerstone of Axel's philosophy. Upon arriving in North Dakota, Axel became a student of his new environment. He saw the American settlers building against the cold with brute force, piling up wood and trusting in the thickness of a single barrier. He saw it as a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. The prairie cold was not a static force to be blocked. It was a dynamic, fluid one that stole heat through movement. He watched the native creatures. He saw the bison, with its dense, downy undercoat protected by a layer of long, coarse guard hairs. The outer layer broke the wind. The inner layer trapped the air, holding the animal's warmth against its skin. 2 layers, with stillness in between. One day, while trading for supplies, he had a brief but profound conversation with a Cree elder named Aski. Axel, through gestures and broken phrases, tried to explain his idea for a house within a house. The old man listened patiently, his weathered face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly and, using a stick to draw on the dirt, sketched the cross-section of a traditional winter lodge. He drew an outer windbreak of brush and hide, and then an inner, heavily insulated living space built low to the ground. He pointed to the space between the two. He didn't have the Norwegian words, but his meaning was universal. He was showing Axel the same principle, discovered and perfected over centuries on this very land. The physics behind Axel's memory, the bison's coat, and the Cree lodge was simple, elegant, and utterly ignored by his neighbors. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. A thick, single wall, like the ones on Silas Croft's house, fought conduction reasonably well, but it was helpless against the primary thief of warmth on the plains: convection. The relentless wind, moving at 40, 50, or 60 miles per hour, physically stripped the heat from the outer surface of the walls. This process, known as wind chill, dramatically accelerated heat loss, forcing the stove inside to burn ever hotter just to keep pace. Furthermore, any tiny crack or seam in that single wall became a nozzle for icy air, creating drafts that made the interior unbearable. Axel's design neutralized this threat. His outer barn served as the bison's guard hairs, or the Cree windbreak. It was not meant to be warm. It was a sacrificial layer, a massive windbreak designed to absorb the kinetic energy of the wind. The air inside the barn, though still cold, would become relatively still. This vast pocket of calm, dead air, was the true insulation. The inner cabin, the Quonset hut, was therefore protected from convective heat loss entirely. The wind could not touch its walls. It only had to contend with the much slower, more manageable process of conduction through the still, cold air of the barn. It was the difference between standing in a gale and standing in a calm, cold room. One would kill you, the other was merely uncomfortable. Axel was building not a wall, but a system. He was building a pocket of stillness. The construction began in late September, a methodical process that became a season-long spectacle for the township. First, Axel erected the outer barn. It was a conventional post and beam structure, 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a standard gabled roof. He used cottonwood, which was plentiful but not ideal, and planked the walls with single-layer siding. He made no special effort to seal the cracks. To his neighbors, this first stage looked normal, if a bit rough. Silas Croft noted that Axel's joinery was precise, but his choice of unseasoned wood for the siding was a sign of a man in a hurry. He assumed, like everyone else, that Axel would move his family into one corner of the barn for the first winter, a common but miserable practice. Then came the baffling second act. In the very center of the barn's dirt floor, Axel laid out a footprint of just 12 by 16 feet. He dug a shallow foundation, barely a foot deep, and lined it with fieldstones. Then, he began to build the ribs of his inner cabin. He used green ash saplings, which he had spent weeks harvesting and soaking in the creek. He built a form on the ground, a gentle curve, and bent the pliable wood over it, clamping the pieces together to create arched rafters. When they dried, they held their distinctive, semicircular shape. He raised these curved ribs, creating the skeleton of a low, rounded hut, its highest point a mere 6 feet and 10 inches from the floor. This low ceiling was another deliberate, crucial choice, designed to minimize the volume of air that needed to be heated and to keep that precious warm air close to the occupants. The mockery intensified when he began to insulate the structure. Between the ash ribs, he created a double wall, sheathing the interior and exterior of the frame with cheap, thin pine boards, leaving a 10-inch gap between them. This cavity he began to fill with a mixture he prepared in a wheelbarrow: sawdust from the local mill, dried moss he'd collected from the riverbanks, and dry prairie grass. It was a loose, fluffy mixture full of tiny air pockets. "He's stuffing his walls with trash," one farmer commented, "a fire waiting to happen." But Axel knew that the power of insulation came from trapped air, and this mixture was nothing but millions of tiny pockets of it. He layered the exterior of the Quonset with thick tar paper, meticulously overlapping each seam. On top of this, he piled sawed bricks, cut from the prairie itself, creating a thick earthen shell nearly 2 feet thick at the base and tapering towards the top. The final structure looked more like a part of the earth than a piece of carpentry. Silas Croft paid a visit one crisp October day, ostensibly to offer some neighborly advice, but really to satisfy his own curiosity about the folly. He stepped from the bright, windy afternoon into the relative calm of the outer barn. The air inside was still and cool. He found Axel carefully fitting a small cast-iron stove into the inner cabin, meticulously sealing the flue pipe with clay and tin flashing where it passed through the layers of the roof. "Johansson," Croft began, his voice echoing in the cavernous barn, "a man needs a high ceiling. Lets the smoke out, lets the air circulate. All you've built there is a baker's oven. You'll suffocate in it." Axel paused his work, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at Croft's own house, visible on the next rise, with its proud second story and tall, elegant windows. He knew that those same windows would soon be cataracts of ice, and that the high ceilings would create a permanent layer of frigid air at floor level, chilling the feet and sickening the children. "Heat stays low," Axel said, his English still thick with the rhythms of his native tongue. "Here." He patted the low, curved ceiling of his hut. Croft scoffed, kicking at a loose piece of sod. "This is America, not some cramped fjord. We have space. We build big. If it gets cold, we cut more wood. It's that simple. You've wasted half a barn to build a root cellar a man can't even stand up straight in." He pointed to the massive 10-foot gap between the inner cabin and the barn's outer walls. "What's all this for? You could have stalls for a dozen cattle in this wasted space." Axel looked at the empty space, the buffer zone that was the entire point of his creation. He didn't have the words or the inclination to explain the nuances of convective heat transfer. He offered a simple, 2-word explanation that was both perfectly accurate and utterly mystifying to his neighbor. "For the stillness," he said. Croft just shook his head and walked away, more convinced than ever that the Norwegian was a fool. Axel returned to his work, ignoring the whispers and the stares. He knew the prairie's final examination was coming. His structure was not an argument. It was a calculation, and he had checked his figures twice. The winter of 1887 began deceptively. December was cold but clear, with light snows that dusted the brown landscape in a picturesque blanket of white. The settlers went about their routines, the men checking trap lines and cutting cords of wood, the women preserving the last of the autumn harvest. The talk in the small township of Pembina was of land prices and the coming railroad. Axel Johansson's strange nest became an accepted, if peculiar, feature of the local geography. Children would sometimes dare each other to run up and touch its sod-covered walls, as if it were a troll's burrow from a fairy tale. Inside, Axel, his wife Elin, and their young son lived in a small, self-contained world of quiet warmth. Then came January 12th, 1888. The day dawned with an eerie, unseasonable warmth. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and a light mist softened the edges of the horizon. Farmers, Silas Croft among them, saw it as a welcome respite, a January thaw that would allow them to get outdoor chores done. Children walked to the one-room schoolhouse without their heaviest coats. The sky was a uniform milky gray, but held no apparent menace. No one saw the blue-black wall of cloud hurtling down from Saskatchewan at over 60 miles per hour. It was not a storm front that could be watched as it approached. It was a cataclysm that fell from the sky all at once. At midday, the world changed. The temperature plunged as if a switch had been thrown. In the space of 3 hours, it dropped from 34 degrees Fahrenheit to 20 below zero, and it kept falling. The wind arrived with a sound that was not a whistle or a moan, but a solid, physical roar, a shriek that seemed to come from the throat of the earth itself. The air filled instantly with snow, not flakes, but a blinding, scouring powder of ice crystals, so fine it could pass through the tiniest crack. Visibility dropped to zero. A man could not see his own hand in front of his face. This was the arrival of the schoolhouse blizzard. Inside Silas Croft's handsome 2-story house, the change was immediate and terrifying. The pleasant warmth of the morning vanished. The wind slammed into the north-facing wall with the force of a physical blow. The entire structure shuddered. A low, constant moan began to emanate from the walls as the super-chilled air sucked the heat through the single layer of wood. The windows, which had been clear an hour before, were instantly painted over with a thick, opaque layer of frost, glass-thick ice that sealed them shut. A fine, glittering dust of snow began to pour from the edges of the window frames and from beneath the front door. The stove, a large and expensive model from Chicago, was stoked with seasoned oak, yet its heat seemed to vanish a few feet from its iron belly. The high ceilings that Croft had been so proud of now worked against him, creating a vast, useless volume of cold air overhead, while a bone-chilling draft scoured the floor. Croft's wife Mary huddled by the stove, wrapping their infant son in every blanket they owned. "Silas, I can't get him warm," she said, her voice trembling. The baby's cries were thin and weak. Croft fed more wood into the fire, but it was like trying to heat the outdoors. The insatiable convection, driven by the hurricane-force winds on his outer walls, was stealing the warmth faster than he could generate it. He could feel the cold radiating from the walls, a palpable, vampiric presence. He went to the woodpile by the back door, only to find it was already being buried by a massive, sculpted drift. The snow was moving and piling with terrifying speed. He realized with a jolt of panic that his main woodpile, 20 yards from the house, was now completely inaccessible. They had only what was on the porch. It would not last the night. Miles away, inside Axel Johansson's nest, the world was entirely different. The storm's arrival was an acoustic event, not a thermal one. The outer barn groaned and shrieked under the wind's assault. The plank walls rattled and the roof timbers howled as the blizzard hammered against them. It sounded like they were at the bottom of a raging waterfall. But inside the low, curved walls of the inner Quonset, the air was profoundly, almost sacredly, still. Not a single draft stirred the flame of their oil lamp. Axel's small, efficient stove glowed with a gentle, steady heat, fed by a small log of cottonwood every hour. The heat radiated from the stove, was caught by the low-curved ceiling, and circulated gently back down, creating an even, comfortable envelope of warmth. The physics of survival were playing out in real time. The outer barn was performing its sacrificial duty perfectly. It broke the wind, creating a massive, 10-foot-thick buffer of trapped, unmoving air. This dead air, though bitterly cold, likely 10 or 20 degrees below zero, was a phenomenal insulator. The inner cabin's well-packed walls of sawdust, moss, and sod were not being assaulted by a 70-mile-per-hour wind chill of 80 below. They were merely conducting heat into a calm, static environment. The rate of heat loss was fractional compared to what the Croft house was enduring. Axel had separated the two primary functions of a shelter. The outer layer provided structural resistance to the wind, while the inner layer provided thermal resistance to the cold. His neighbors had tried to make a single wall do both jobs, and it was failing catastrophically at both. Axel sat at his small wooden table, calm and methodical. On the wall, a precious thermometer, brought from the old country, registered a steady 66 degrees Fahrenheit. He had a large, dry supply of wood stacked neatly against one interior wall of the barn, completely protected from the snow. He had food, water, and fuel, all within the protected zone. He was not fighting the storm. He was nestled in a pocket of calm he had designed for this exact purpose. He looked at his wife and son, sleeping peacefully in a small bed. There was no fear here. There was only the dull roar of the distant, defeated wind and the quiet, steady warmth of a principle understood and honored. As the first day of the blizzard bled into a night of absolute blackness and screaming wind, Axel Johansson's vindication was not a feeling of triumph, but a quiet, solemn confirmation of his knowledge. While his neighbors were engaged in a desperate battle for survival, he was simply living. He maintained his routine with the same methodical calm he had used to build the structure. Periodically, he would place another small log into the stove. He would then open a small ledger and make a note of the time and the fuel consumed. This was not for pride, but for data. He was an empiricist at heart, and he wanted to know, precisely, how his system was performing. He also took temperature readings. He had a second thermometer hanging inside the barn, in the dead air space. He would briefly open his small, well-sealed door, step into the frigid stillness of the barn, note the temperature, a consistent 15 below zero, and then step back into the 66-degree warmth of his living space. An 81-degree difference, maintained by a tiny stove and a barrier of sod, trash, and intelligently arranged space. He performed a simple smoke test, holding a smoldering wick near the floor and the single small window. The smoke rose vertically, undisturbed. There were no drafts. His house did not leak. It was a sealed vessel of warmth. This collection of data was his true victory, objective, measurable proof that his design was not just effective, but radically efficient. Meanwhile, the Croft house had become a scene of escalating desperation. By morning of the second day, the temperature inside their main room had dropped to the low 40s, despite the stove burning at full capacity. They had burned through the porch wood and were now breaking up chairs and a small dresser to feed the flames. The fine snow had worked its way into every corner, coating surfaces with a layer of icy powder. Mary Croft had not slept. She held the baby against her own body, under all their blankets, trying to share her own dwindling warmth. The child was lethargic, its breathing shallow. Mary looked at her husband, her eyes wide with a terror that had eclipsed all pride. "Silas, we won't make it through another night," she whispered, her words frosting in the air. "The baby is so cold." Silas Croft, a man who had never admitted defeat in his life, knew she was right. His confidence, his belief in bigger and better, had frozen and shattered. He looked at the roaring, ineffective stove and the furniture being consumed for a few moments of pathetic heat. He thought of the Norwegian's strange, low burrow. He remembered the word Axel had used, stillness. Now, in the howling chaos of his own home, he finally understood. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, took a deep breath of the frigid air in his own house, and pulled open the back door. The storm met him with a solid wall of white, a force that stole his breath and tried to knock him from his feet. Tying a rope from the door handle around his waist, he began the 100-yard journey to Johansson's barn, a pilgrimage of desperation through a hell of ice and wind. The journey was an epic of inches. Croft crawled more than he walked, blinded by the snow, guided only by a vague sense of direction and the feel of the frozen ground beneath his mittens. The wind tore at him, seeking any gap in his clothing. It was a malevolent, personal assault. When his hand finally struck the solid wood of Axel's barn, he wept with relief. He fumbled along the wall until he found the large barn door drifted halfway shut. He squeezed through the gap and fell into the relative quiet within. The change was instantaneous and shocking. The wind's physical blow was gone, replaced by its muffled, distant roar. The air was frigid, but it was still. It was the stillness Axel had spoken of. Croft staggered through the dim light towards the faint glow emanating from the small structure in the center of the barn. He knocked on the small, solid door. When Axel opened it, the contrast was almost violent. A wave of dense, quiet warmth washed over Croft, a sensation so profound it felt like life itself. He stumbled inside, blinking in the steady lamplight. He saw Elin Johansson tending to her son, who was playing quietly on a rug. He saw the small, glowing stove, the neat pile of wood, the thermometer on the wall reading 66 degrees. He saw a world not under siege, but at peace. He looked at Axel, his face caked with ice, his beard frozen solid. The words of apology, of concession, caught in his throat. Instead, humbled and awed, he asked the question that had been tormenting him. It was the question of a student, not a rival. "How?" he rasped, his voice raw. "How is the air so still?" Axel Johansson did not smile in triumph. There was no hint of, "I told you so," in his eyes. He was a practical man, and this was a practical problem, not a personal victory. He simply nodded towards the empty space Croft had just crossed inside the barn. "The wind fights the barn," he said simply. "It never touches the house." He then gestured for Croft to sit, and without another word, he put on his own heavy coat. "Your family," he stated. It was not a question. Together, they tethered themselves to a longer rope, and Axel, who knew how to read the wind and the contours of the drifts, led the way back to the Croft house. Within the hour, Mary Croft and her infant son were brought into the life-saving warmth of Johansson's nest. Mary burst into tears of relief as Elin wrapped the baby in warm blankets and placed him near the gentle, steady heat of the stove. The vindication was complete, not with a boast, but with the quiet, rhythmic breathing of a rescued child. When the great blizzard finally broke on the third day, it left behind a world transformed, a landscape of surreal, sculpted white under a painfully blue sky. The official temperature was 37 degrees below zero. For the settlers of Pembina County, the silence was as shocking as the storm's roar had been. As families emerged from their frigid, battered homes, the true cost began to be tallied, in livestock frozen in the fields, and, in some tragic cases, in neighbors who had been caught outside. But in the Johansson barn, 2 families had weathered the cataclysm in safety and comfort. Word spread quickly. The story of Silas Croft's rescue and the impossible warmth of Axel's nest became the central topic of conversation. In the days that followed, a steady stream of visitors made their way to the Norwegians' homestead. They were no longer mockers or skeptics. They were pilgrims seeking knowledge. They came into the outer barn, felt the profound stillness of the air, and then stepped into the inner cabin, their faces registering the same shock and awe that Croft had felt. They saw the evidence with their own eyes: the small stove, the minimal wood consumption recorded in Axel's ledger, the undeniable comfort of the living space. Silas Croft, a changed and humbled man, became Axel's most fervent advocate. "We were fools," he told his neighbors, his voice devoid of its former bluster. "We were trying to shout down the storm with a bigger fire." He understood that the secret was to give the wind nothing to talk to. Axel, uncomfortable with the attention, would simply invite them in. He took a piece of charcoal, and on a smoothed pine board, he would sketch the design. He drew the outer shell, labeling it Vindveg, wind wall. He drew the inner, insulated core, labeling it Varme room, warm room. Then he would tap the empty space between them. Død luft, he would say, dead air. The lesson was transferred not through elaborate lectures, but through simple diagrams and the irrefutable experience of stepping from a cold barn into a warm room. That summer, a new kind of construction began across the county. It was a season of retrofitting and rethinking. Few could afford to build an entirely new structure like Axel's, but they adapted his principle. Several families built smaller, heavily insulated winter rooms inside their existing farmhouses, rooms that could be sealed off from the larger, drafty structure. They packed the walls with sawdust, wool, or straw. They lowered the ceilings and installed smaller, more efficient stoves. Silas Croft, applying the lesson on a grander scale, built a massive, insulated wall inside the north side of his barn, creating a buffered zone where he could keep his most vulnerable livestock, a project he undertook with Axel's direct guidance. The phrase Johansson's nest was no longer a term of ridicule. It became a term of art, a local shorthand for intelligent, efficient building. The following winter served as the ultimate proof of concept. It was a typically harsh Dakota winter, but its impact on the community was radically different. Families who had adopted the winter room concept reported burning less than half the wood they had the previous year. Their homes were not just warmer, they were healthier. Miss Eleanor Vance, the schoolteacher who had survived the 1888 blizzard by keeping her students huddled in the schoolhouse overnight, noted in her journal the dramatic improvement in her pupils' health. There were fewer cases of the lung fever and consumption that had plagued the community in prior winters. The infants born that year, including a new, healthy Croft baby, thrived in the steady, draft-free warmth of the new rooms. The innovation had saved more than just fuel. It had saved lives. The practical wisdom of the Norwegian stranger had been woven into the fabric of the community's survival. The legacy of Axel Johansson's design did not remain confined to Pembina County. Miss Vance, a meticulous documentarian and a correspondent for a regional agricultural journal called The Dakota Farmer, wrote a lengthy article in the autumn of 1889. She titled it, "On the Principle of the Thermal Buffer, How a Norwegian Settler Tamed the Prairie Wind." She detailed the construction of Axel's structure, the physics of its success during the Great Blizzard, and its subsequent adoption by the community. She included Axel's simple diagrams of the wind wall and the warm room. The article was published and circulated widely, read by homesteaders across the northern plains who were facing the same life-or-death struggle against the cold. The idea of the house within a house, or the buffered winter room, began to appear in sod houses in Nebraska and timber claims in Montana, a piece of anonymous folk wisdom whose specific origins were soon forgotten, but whose practical benefits endured. What Axel Johansson had built, out of memory and observation, is now understood and validated by a century of building science. His outer barn was what modern architects would call a weather barrier, or an exterior shell, designed primarily to shed wind and moisture. The inner Quonset was the insulated thermal envelope, the core that actually contained the heat. The crucial space between them was a tempered buffer zone, a concept now used in advanced passive house design and cold climate architecture. He had intuitively understood the principles of decoupling a building's structure from its thermal layer to prevent thermal bridging, where heat is conducted directly out through solid materials. His sawdust and moss insulation, while primitive, was an effective way to maximize R value, a measure of thermal resistance, by trapping countless tiny pockets of air. His entire system was, in essence, a massive, habitable thermos bottle. The story of Johansson's nest is more than just a historical anecdote about a clever design. It is a parable about two fundamentally different approaches to facing a challenge. One, born of arrogance and convention, sought to meet overwhelming force with brute force, a battle it was destined to lose. The other, born of humility, observation, and a wisdom passed down through generations, sought not to conquer the force, but to sidestep it, to understand its nature and render it irrelevant. Axel Johansson listened to the lessons of his grandfather, of the bison, and of the land's original inhabitants. He chose intelligence over strength, stillness over noise, and preparation over pride. He survived not because his walls were thicker, but because his thinking was deeper. He had not built a house inside a house. He had built a pocket of stillness inside the storm, proving that the most powerful defense against the howling chaos of the world was not a stronger fortress, but a wiser space.